I've recently been doing some writing about the Star Wars sequel films with the aim of levying one very specific critique at how they were written, and I realized that I couldn't actually make that critique on its own without dipping into the substance of a tangential issue with these movies that I had all but forgotten in the wake of the fallout after Disney announced all these upcoming films were either cancelled or becoming streaming series. Personally, I think that was a pretty big loss, but I haven't had the near irrational hatred for Disney Star Wars that some people have had. I obviously think there's room for criticism. That's what this video and the other video where I cover Star Wars will both be about, and I may visit this topic again. So subscribe and turn those notifications on for that if you want more. But I think the best critiques are charitable to the creative vision of the creatives. The problem I have with this approach occurs mainly with two Disney Star Wars projects, those being Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. I think these are pretty unchallenged for their places as the two worst Star Wars films of all time. I was finishing up my critique of the writing of the character of Rey in the Star Wars sequel trilogy and going back to cap off my observations while also editing down the video script, and I felt it would be a disservice to not say something about this issue. Each Star Wars film has their sort of perspective characters and central characters, with a core cast that forms the protag squad of each film. For example, George Lucas once noted that the droids are the perspective characters of the original trilogy, while the story actually revolves around the Skywalkers. In addition to Luke and Leia, their group includes a partner, Han, and two friends, Chewie and Lando. In the Star Wars prequel films, Lucas is even more efficient because he groups the perspective characters in with the trio. The story is about Padme, and implicitly therefore also Anakin, and is told from the perspective of the Jedi. When I was writing the other video, I made a note of who I thought the story of the sequel films was about, why that mattered, and what it said about Rey. That logic also comes into play when we attempt to understand the characters of Finn and Poe. Allegedly, J.J. Abrams was originally going to have Poe die off-screen, or as close to off-screen as a crash from which only one person awakens can be. And sure enough, when Poe returns, it's a big twist moment. But how Poe got off Jakku, how he escaped from the crash, and everything stitching those sequences together isn't much the focus of the film because it isn't very important. Poe has a presence in the first act, an inciting incident, then makes his exit until Abrams has something for him to do again at the end of the second act. Finn suffers from the inverse treatment. He's a cowardly comic relief character whose arc deals with him grappling with the fact that he's fleeing the First Order and implicitly also running away from the fight, until he suddenly doesn't because he likes Rey. This makes sense from the perspective of his motivation as a character, but it puts Abrams in a bind because it means Finn basically reaches the end of his arc in this movie during the second act, overcoming his fear and embracing his inner Jedi, at least principally. Abrams has Finn double down on this in aiding the Resistance in their raid on Starkiller Base, and again when he duels Kylo. I don't really understand why Abrams does this. I realize I am not the kind of film buff some people on this platform are, but it vexes me. Abrams swaps the characterization of Rey and Finn midway through the film, having Rey run away from everyone while Finn rushes into danger. These characters were arguing with each other not moments ago in the film about whether they were going to fight the First Order on principle. The human emotions here scan just fine because the actors are competent, but it doesn't make any sense as a directorial decision insofar as I can tell. What was he cooking? We get several beats in the film establishing Finn's reluctance to fight. He refuses to fire on civilians, escapes with Poe, lies to Rey, tries to trick Han, and links up with some freelancers all just to get away from the First Order. He wants no part of this. When Rey is in trouble, he drops everything to help her because she's basically the one person he cares about who he knows is alive. Cool, good, but this means Abrams now has to either find something else to do with Finn's character, or he has to play the exact same beat multiple times. Is it significant that Kylo calls Finn a traitor? Well, kind of, but it already happened, so we're just retreading ground, and he was using his lightsaber and trying to come back to help Rey then as well, so it's just the same plot beat twice for no discernible reason. The Force Awakens got roasted on release despite being overwhelmingly popular for one singular thing, which was its lack of identity. The one negative thing everyone could agree on is that we just got A New Hope a second time. The problem is that even with all the sniping about Starkiller Base or Mary Sue's or the little white cuck ball, this still isn't really true. We got A New Hope, but worse. The original Star Wars film has long been upheld as a very standard case of plotting for its characters. There's little surprising about the way Luke, Leia, and Han's story develops, but it's a fun ride nonetheless. Doing this all a second time would feel uninspired, but I don't even think that captures the problem. This isn't standard character writing, it isn't even competent character writing, and it's barely coherent plotting. Nothing here really strains the imagination overmuch as long as we remember we're dealing in a galaxy of space wizards and impossible technologies, but the way Abrams shunts the characters from life-threatening situation to life-threatening situation, whereupon the introduction of each subsequent threat causes the stakes of the previous one to be forgotten, has caused me to, for years now, wonder if he really had a solid grasp on how to tell this story. Something has to move his characters into place, usually. The First Order tracking BB-8 forces Rey and Finn to escape in the Millennium Falcon, which then puts them in a situation where they're forced to fight off TIE fighters, which then causes them to take damage that they have to repair or risk death. Whereupon they are interrupted by a boarding party, which turns out to be Han and Chewie, but they're pursued by a gang, so we're in another life and death situation where our heroes have to make a daring escape. Hopefully they don't haplessly wander into yet another deadly situation, possibly one concerning some Rathtars, which they will then have to escape in a manner that conveniently all puts them on the Millennium Falcon to set up their mutual entry on Takodana. Some people might call this contrived, but I think that's a little too meta. Contrivance isn't the issue here. The problem is that none of this is really happening because of any greater cause or ambition motivated by conflicts relating to our characters. All this stuff just kind of happens to them, the way that Luke's aunt and uncle being killed happens to him. But where that results in his choosing to strike out on his own, this is a series of back-to-back turnarounds that frankly makes me a little queasy. It's more of a theme park ride than a story. Maybe that's all being a little uncharitable, and I do think I could find more positive things to say about The Force Awakens, but all I can think is it's a little tough because this happens again in The Rise of Skywalker. People were pretty harsh on The Last Jedi, and I think it could have done way more, like actually threatening to end on Rey turning to the dark side, or giving us more depth to some of the economic and political implications that it touches on. But the thing that film has going for it is that most everything that happens is due to something a character in the film feels, wants, or needs. It's an actual character-driven story in a trilogy that seems totally unconcerned with keeping constant what its characters are feeling and why. I go into more depth with this in my Rey video, but her writing is all over the place in the first and third film of this trilogy. But at least in The Rise of Skywalker, she has something resembling an arc. Poe's arc is contained mainly to The Last Jedi, giving us yet another reason why that film is at minimum the best of a bad batch, pun intended, if not an actually competently made film by a decent director. I don't like being rude about people's art, but I severely question Abrams' vision. What is Poe's arc exactly in the two films that JJ actually directs? In the first film, he recruits Finn, and they get some sweet and triumphant moments. In the third film, we find out that he has a kind of checkered past as a smuggler, but mostly he exists in the same capacity as the previous films. In the second film, he has an entire arc about learning to be more than a warrior, but also a leader and a member of a cause that he has to trust and follow as well as lead, so he experiences personal growth as the result of tempering his eagerness to fight in everything he learns from characters like Holdo, who takes little credit for a plan she does not disclose and dies for a cause with almost zero hesitation. She doesn't get a big Yahoo victory yell as she swoops in to save her friends. She just dies suddenly for a cause she believed in with her entire being, and the revelation that he treated her unfairly seems to change Poe as he finally learns the lesson Leia was trying to teach him from the beginning. This is what a character acted by Oscar Isaac looks like when you actually give him stuff to do on screen. It's good. Maybe it's not my favorite Star Wars, but it works. He's a good actor. The way that Abrams gives these characters so little, almost nothing in the case of Poe and very little that stays consistent in the case of Finn, really bothers me, because these are supposed to be people that offer perspective or context to a narrative that admittedly isn't mainly about them. As I discuss in the Rey video, all signs point to this trilogy actually being about Kylo Ren. He's the only character who feels like he has an arc across 3 films that is actually about who he is and who he wants to be. The Rise of Skywalker actually makes Rey's character almost entirely about her relationship with him, and Palpatine as well. But as far as our larger sense of perspective in the narrative goes, we're dealing with a scavenger, a rebel, and a defector, plus later an engineer, another defector, a criminal, etc. And so a picture starts to form about where our perspective in this narrative is coming from. The droids were sort of a simultaneously conscious but non-human perspective in a wider world connected by a force between all living things. The Jedi were an institution presiding over one perspective on that force, tying its philosophy to the fall of a democracy as observed by one of its senators. The Resistance protagonists are, by this same logic, a group of people who exist on the margins of society and whose perspectives contextualize their view of the central mythology of power and empire, embodied in the successor to Darth Vader. All of this sets up the real nail in the coffin for my sentiment towards Abrams and how he directed these films. I don't really love his style, but all that proves is that at the very most he didn't really seem to understand, or alternatively didn't seem to care for what George Lucas was doing, making him the wrong sort of man for the job. We can understand that this was a missed opportunity and meditate on what might have been, without our sense of what's really important getting lost in a sea of what-ifs and might-have-beens. But there's one what-if of which I never was really able to let go for lack of closure, and that one final point is why we're here. I don't think Finn and Poe were done right by these 2 films, but I especially think they should have been together. When John Boyega and Oscar Isaac delivered their performances in The Force Awakens, many fans clued into the way that Isaac played Poe Dameron as a sort of dashing and borderline flirtatious companion to Finn, while Boyega's Finn did the same to Daisy Ridley in her portrayal of Rey. This, combined with the fact that many fans also interpreted Kylo Ren and Rey as having some romantic tension in their relationship, fed into the ship Storm Pilot. A lot has been said about shipping culture, but frankly, compared to the Reylo debates that were happening over those years, the Storm Pilot conversation felt pretty subdued, all things considered. The Last Jedi gives Finn a new connection in Rose Tico, while Finn and Poe had little to do with each other in that film, beyond a couple scenes. So this seemed totally up in the air and without real consequence until J.J. Abrams teased that The Rise of Skywalker, the final film in the newly minted 9-film Skywalker saga, would contain some kind of gay relationship. Some fans may have wanted Storm Pilot, but it was not to be. They weren't totally delusional in this, however. There were lines drawn over the years connecting these new projects to gay representation. Abrams himself made a number of comments touching on this issue, and people wondered if maybe he was going to be the person to pull it off. In an article for the Daily Beast, Jen Yamato characterized Abrams' remarks about diversity in Hollywood thusly. 2 months and $2 billion box office dollars later, Star Wars The Force Awakens has reaped huge returns for Disney with its most progressive episode yet. Now that Daisy Ridley's Rey and John Boyega's Finn have given the Star Wars franchise its first female Jedi and Black lead respectively, does its fearless director J.J. Abrams see a future for a gay character in the galaxy? Of course, Abrams said Thursday night at his Bad Robot HQ, where he hosted the US-Ireland Alliance's annual Oscar Wilde Awards, ahead of Sunday's Oscars, where The Force Awakens is nominated in 5 categories. When I talk about inclusivity, it's not excluding gay characters, it's about inclusivity, so of course. By Abrams' logic, the sprawling Star Wars universe couldn't possibly exist without a gay populace, even if we haven't seen a single character identified as gay thus far. I would love it, he said. To me, the fun of Star Wars is the glory of possibility. So it seems insanely narrow-minded and counterintuitive to say that there wouldn't be a homosexual character in that world. Amid the #OscarsSoWhite controversy, Abrams has been vocal about the need for Hollywood to not just talk about, but take action in the name of diversity. I think we all have a hell of a lot to do, and I think it is insane to me that we still have to have a conversation about inclusivity. It's shameful, he told the Daily Beast last month. We all need to do better to represent this world. It's something that is important to me, and is something we're focusing on at Bad Robot. Maybe, as some hopeful Star Wars fans have theorized, The Force Awakens already introduced the franchise's first gay character. Who wouldn't ship Boyega's Finn and Oscar Isaac's Poe Dameron? Who wouldn't, indeed? Similarly, clips of Abrams taking up this perspective would circulate, like this one from the Associated Press, roughly a month later.
I was asked if I could imagine a homosexual character in the Star Wars universe, and my immediate knee-jerk reaction was, of course. Star Wars is all about inclusivity, it's all about unifying us. It makes no sense that that vast, amazing world with a multitude of planets and locales would not include people who are gay. So it was an immediate response to a question that seemed pretty obvious. I think that the success of Force Awakens is further indication that people want inclusivity, that inclusivity is good for the bottom line. Cynics might say, oh, it doesn't count, it's Star Wars. They'll always find reasons to not shake up the status quo, but I think it is inclusion is only good for the audience. It's good for the people making the films. The more and different voices we can add to the creative process, I think the better.
This is the side of J.J. Abrams that I find rather sympathetic. This is clearly his attempt to be a get-along creative in a broad industry where he'll work with a lot of different people. Hollywood is often characterized as stupendously, sometimes even delusionally liberal, but broadly, as far as I can see, the motivation is practicality and not ideology. Sometimes you want a production to appeal to a broad array of demographics, and if you're also pulling from people of many backgrounds to create it, diversity is going to be in the picture somewhere, even if it's not owed to any kind of principled effort. But this is also the problem with Hollywood. Its reputation as a bastion of diversity is, when it comes to what we're actually allowed to see, a total sham. In January of 2020, a report from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative pointed out that over the past 13 years, male directors still outnumbered female directors by 20-1, whereas film reception by gender of director was almost identical. Of those, white women vastly outnumbered any other group of women by race. Data appears to show that women may have fewer opportunities to build their careers, compounding a lack of overall presence at this level in directing. Another similar report from August of 2024 suggests that while women make up roughly half the population, in terms of on-screen presence, they're resting at about 1/3 of speaking roles. If that ratio is failing so hard and correlates with a lack of career opportunities, what's to be said for the LGBT community? Well, in terms of on-screen representation, the report isn't too sunny. Over 3/4 of the films evaluated didn't even have a queer character in a speaking role. Not only are white men still the majority of directors in these projects, they also seem to give very little consideration statistically for the representation of marginalized groups. It's a grim reality that despite the delusions of internet posters and commentators who swear up and down that everything is gay now, or that there's some kind of anti-male agenda, what occupies their eyes is a tiny slice of what is truly going on. Very little of what Hollywood makes is actually gay. This brings us back to one particular line in that Daily Beast article. Even if we haven't seen a single character identified as gay thus far, this is the real issue. Abrams' position is sensical on its own, but it does reveal the central dispute of gay representation in Star Wars. We can easily imagine there would be plenty of gay couples in a galaxy far, far away. So why, as our points of contact with that galaxy through theaters and streaming services continue to expand, are we not meeting them? Disney has given us more Star Wars, but ironically, the more we get, the more the absence of certain elements becomes conspicuous. The problem with that faraway galaxy from long ago is that we're making it right here and now and don't seem to be doing it justice. The pro-diversity and pro-gay comments from Abrams regarding Star Wars stretch back to 2016, when observations about how Hollywood had failed to deliver on the idea of an increasingly diverse and egalitarian workplace and industry were themselves common and mainstream. This wouldn't be the last time Abrams would come close to teasing some kind of gay potential for Star Wars. But Abrams was in a tricky spot. On the one hand, his response about diversity seems to at least contain some shred of principle. On the other hand, during the lead-up and in the follow-up to the release of The Rise of Skywalker, this rhetoric was dogged by the release of Bob Iger's book, The Ride of a Lifetime, and comments by the cast about their roles. There's an infamous clip posted to Twitter by Entertainment Weekly of an interview with Oscar Isaac that was really the start of this discourse in November of 2019. Alright, even though I have COVID-19, Entertainment Weekly has all of their stuff, I guess, in the Content ID system for YouTube, so they don't want me to use their audio and video, so I'm just going to read you what he says in the interview. He says, "I think that there is a deep, deep connection between the two of them. There is a deep, deep connection between me and John, and I think that ended up working out really well, because particularly in the new film, we get to work together a lot. You really get to see Finn and Poe figuring out stuff together. They're on missions together, there's a lot of camaraderie, there's tension, there's fights, as people that are close have now and then. Ultimately, they believe in each other, and they're a team along with Rey, who's the MVP, the most incredible, the badass fighter there. These guys love each other, and the truth is, as a performer, I can only do so much because I don't get to write the scripts, but other than say, I would think that would be a great way for the story to go, and a much more original one, but I think that what we can say is that it holds that potential." But this problem was soon to spread into December, when more and more articles would cover in specific the comments by director and actors alike, such as this piece for Variety by Adam B. Very. Personally, I kind of hoped and wished that maybe that would have been taken further in the other films, but I don't have control, Isaac said. It seemed like a natural progression, but sadly enough, it's a time when people are too afraid. I think of I don't know what. Isaac noted that the ambiguity of the characters' relationship might allow more people to see themselves in the characters. But if they would have been boyfriends, that would have been fun. Though he was less definitive than Isaac, Boyega also noted the lack of a clear romantic connection between Finn and Poe in The Rise of Skywalker when speaking with Variety. They've always had a quite loving and open relationship, in which it wouldn't be too weird if it went beyond it, Boyega said, but at the same time, they are just platonic at the moment. Even The Rise of Skywalker director J.J. Abrams, famously circumspect about revealing anything about his films in advance, cast some doubt on Finn-Poe coming to life in his film. That relationship to me is far deeper than a romantic one, Abrams told Variety. It is a deep bond that these two have, not just because of the trial by fire in which they met, but also because of their willingness to be as intimate as they are, as afraid as as unsure as they are, and still be bold, and still be daring and brave. This was the point when I started to sour on these pretensions to diversity. It's not that I don't see the good people and how they're trying, but as Isaac said, people are too afraid. It is the role of a queer essayist, maybe, to know exactly what scares them so much. It is one of the oldest implicitly homophobic stereotypes that what gay people have is a sexuality, and what straight people have is love. The slogan "Love is Love" was one I always felt existed in part to address this fact and connect it to the larger struggle for gay marriage rights, which were implicitly connected to the AIDS crisis and the lack of visitation rights afforded to gay couples on that basis when their loved ones were sick and dying. I've seen this connection written about relatively rarely by pro-gay commentators in mainstream media outlets, especially when considering how relevant it has been in my lifetime and how we might stand to lose some of these rights. When AIDS was treated as God's judgment on a sinful lifestyle, conveniently heterosexual-dominated society could at first avert its gaze from the atrocities it allowed. In reflecting upon this, I was reminded of a quote from Karl Marx's Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, wherein he says, "Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering, and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition which requires illusions. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Truly, the deployment of religious reasoning against the LGBT community has not been an accident. It was and remains an entirely functional refutation of our ability as human beings to transform our situation beyond the oppressive conditions of this society. There has been every attempt made against queer identities to keep us in our place. Implicitly, that place is underfoot. When Abrams says that relationship to me is a far deeper one than a romantic one, he is, in fact, perpetrating that same unequal standard that I mentioned earlier that has its roots in this very inequity. Gay people have shallow desire, says mainstream heteronormative society, but straight people have the purity of love, the love of a husband, the love of a wife, the love of a god. Nobody has ever insisted that the relationships between Han Solo and Leia Organa, or between Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala, or between Obi-Wan Kenobi and the Duchess Satine were somehow shallow compared to bonds forged by camaraderie. This assertion that romance is comparatively shallow is reserved only for gay couples. Abrams would go on to defend his decision to include the brief kiss between Commander Daisy and her partner by saying,
"So what is your responsibility as a filmmaker to put diversity on the screen?"
Well, I think it should be every filmmaker's responsibility to not just represent the world as it exists as much as possible on screen, wherever possible, but also behind the camera. You know, we had, you know, an extraordinary second unit director who's an African-American woman. That was the first time that there had been a black woman doing that job. And that was as important to me as having a cast that looked like, you know, more that the world than not. And I'm really proud of not just, you know, on camera, but also, you know, behind the camera, wherever we can bring people in who are not just the usual suspects. And again, it's not about taking away from anyone else. It's about giving opportunities to people who might not have had that chance before. So whether it's a woman in a role that you might not normally see, you know, a woman, whether it's someone of color in a role that you might, you know, and it's becoming more normalized, but I think it's only good for storytelling, diversity, and it's good for business too, because I think people are hungry to see things that don't feel like the same exact thing you've seen forever.
Again, it is incumbent on me to stress that this is a sympathetic dimension to Abrams that would lend some credence to the idea that he's a director people would want to work with, at least in some capacity. It is also a bit funny that Iger's book should have come out earlier that year in September, because there's an oft-quoted passage that appears in pieces, like this one from The Wrap by Jeremy Fuster, saying, "While Lucas attended the Hollywood premiere of The Force Awakens, he told Kennedy and Iger at a private screening days before that he didn't like the film because there was nothing new. In each of the films in the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies," Iger wrote. "In this one," he said, "there weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward." The humor in this should be obvious. Abrams adequately but ironically justifies increasing diversity in films on the premise that this is something people would want to see, as proven by the success of his films. This argument works, but does not acknowledge that his films are probably the least innovative Star Wars has ever been. Lucas criticized the lack of technological innovation, but equally very few boundaries were pushed in diversity. Had Abrams chosen to make main cast members gay, I would feel compelled to defend him at minimum from the accusation that he did nothing new whatsoever, Not what Lucas said, but a common enough remark about Disney's control of Star Wars. But he didn't. I find Abrams' direction of his 2 Star Wars films lacking beyond any others. It would be tough to argue that Johnson did nothing new with Star Wars, although where the film industry at large is concerned, he might have played it too safe by Lucas's standards. Abrams is another story entirely. In fact, his films are total retreads on every level. Visually and narratively, the moments where fans see something they haven't are rare enough to count as exceptions. To my mind, only the scene where Kylo and Rey fight across 2 landscapes with pieces of each location falling into the other as their relationship joins them across impossible distances counts. It's a small enough moment, but resonant enough to count for something. It's not hard to take this all in the context of Star Wars being specifically reconquered by a subset of fans who hated the prequel trilogy. I am not the first person to point this out, but Red Letter Media specifically compared the direction in the prequels to Abrams' Star Trek films, implicitly praising the latter. I wasn't going to bring this up, but I got recommended out of nowhere a little YouTube video that Red Letter Media had actually uploaded to their channel in response to the announcement that Abrams would direct The Force Awakens, titled J.J. Abrams to direct Star Wars 7? Mr. Plinkett agrees. Oops. Others have discussed this at length, but fundamentally I have felt, ever since I set out to work on videos following the reaction to The Last Jedi, that there was an implicitly problematic issue of fandom toxicity in YouTuber critiques that stems from creators couching their takes in performative rage combined with a cynicism at positivity and a conflation of criticism with negativity. I was somewhat more forgiving in those videos of the forerunners of this phenomenon, namely Mr. Plinkett, the nostalgia critic, and the angry video game nerd, all characters portrayed by real critics whose work was popularized through a comedic tone. However, what I failed to mention before is that my video series about videos about The Last Jedi was originally going to feature a larger selection of videos, and was narrowed down to just a handful for the sake of both time and my intent of conveying the arguments with greater and greater clarity. One of the critics I was originally going to cover in that series was Mike Stoklasa of Red Letter Media, the man behind Mr. Plinkett, and I feel I now have the opportunity to safely convey that Mr. Plinkett's prequel reviews are some of the most misleading, uncharitable, and fundamentally mean-spirited videos I have ever seen from a film critic, bar perhaps the nostalgia critic's infamous review of Pink Floyd's The Wall. The trouble with treating the character of Mr. Plinkett with an excess of charitability is that the fans of this content, for lack of a more polite phrase, actually fucking believe this dog shit. With hearts and minds, a group of shallow nerds have hollowed out a space on the internet where the lingua franca uniting film critics with their audiences is genuine hateful misinformation. All one need do is return to those Plinkett prequel videos and listen to how he describes the film. And remember, for your own benefit, the people watching this stuff really believe it. Nothing could more securely drive home the point that it was Stoklasa, not Lucas, who failed to understand Star Wars if we are to follow the former's path in the use of such language than this clip. Get a load of this guy.
You see, in my opinion, where the prequels utterly failed, Star Trek excelled. Star Trek is really engaging. It's fun, adventurous, fast-paced. Heroes are heroes, and villains are villains. And at the very least, you know what's happening. It's everything we did not get in the prequels. At no point were we completely bored and confused. In fact, J.J. Abrams should have directed the prequels, and George Lucas should have directed people to their seats in the theater.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
If every Mr. Plinkett video ended with the phrase, "is what an idiot would say," still, frankly, the disciplines of the humanities would not be done justice. Nobody tell this guy about all the parts of the original Star Wars trilogy where Luke stands around with other characters as he ponders the moral dimensions of his Jedi path. It's not that a little bile here and there is totally unbecoming of a critic, but pure vomit is nothing more than undigested putrescence. There's another more sympathetic case in Simon Pegg, who actually got to appear in The Force Awakens as Unkar Plutt, famous for the jokes in Spaced where he is made to look like a jerk for making a child cry for liking the prequels. I actually think it's a bit much to attack him over this, since his character is clearly presented as a childish jerk, lacking in self-awareness despite nominally believing this stuff, but it's still shades of Mr. Plinkett as Stoklaas's sock puppet in that regard. There's a video from Now This that I saw and dug back up to watch as I was writing this essay that really strikes a chord with me and helps me empathize with Simon Pegg a lot more, because he's clearly got a lot of empathy for people other than himself.
And I feel so ashamed of the fact that there was actually a victim, a human victim in that. I think most people were regarding Jar Jar Binks like he was a real creature and wailing on him for being annoying or whatever, or not liking him. But there was a person behind that. And I read that and just thought, Christ, you know, I'm one of those people. It makes me feel awful.
You're probably wondering what this all has to do with gay representation in Star Wars, but I would argue it has everything to do with it. When I was a kid, I had this light blue Star Wars shirt that was actually one of my most treasured possessions. Eventually it got so worn out that my parents wanted me to throw it out, but I was resistant and I would not let it go, and even tried to keep it without wearing it for fear of wearing it out even further. I was, after all, a little kid, but also it represented something I cared about a lot. It was a Jar Jar Binks shirt. I felt a bit small and sad when I heard people express such strong hatred for the character when I was younger, frankly, because I didn't think being portrayed as annoying and weird really meant that someone deserved that treatment. Even setting aside Ahmed Best's personal journey, I always felt that Jar Jar being silly and annoying was something in the text itself. Obi-Wan calls him a pathetic life form. The other Gungans reject him. If you know what being rejected for who you are truly means, that's significant. But Lucas took this a step further and led the audience directly into feeling those agitating emotions. And then he showed, for the sake of the story, that Jar Jar had something to offer people, that he was a person trying his best, pun intended, I suppose, and I think that was what connected with me so strongly in that film. Societal rejects deserve sympathy, or so we're led to believe, but we don't act like that. When we're actually asked to filter that sentiment through real biases, through our aesthetic preferences and core beliefs, how many of us can say we've always made the right call? It would be a rare person to say that and not be deluding themselves. Lucas does something wonderful with Jar Jar where he actually challenges the audience to defy their own immediate reaction and see something deeper. Qui-Gon even implicitly makes this the thesis for his Jedi philosophy in the film. It all comes back to midichlorians and symbiont circles. We're part of this great cycle united by tiny little things that drive us. What happens to one of us will affect the other. We must understand this. This attempt to present the audience with something that might antagonize their aesthetic priors and their biases has its mirror in a number of other discourses about film and the arts. John Berger once wrote in the print publication of Ways of Seeing that we never look at just one thing. We are always looking at the relation between things and ourselves. Indeed, the process of what we call media literacy is in part the navigation of the relationship between our I, what lies within, and what lies without. These, far from being points of contrast, are a continuum that allows us to construct understanding, in the same way that we rely on our understanding of ourselves through how others see us to construct our own understanding of ourselves, both combatively and cooperatively, as a discourse. This is represented in Berger's words when he writes that the reciprocal nature of vision is more fundamental than that of spoken dialogue. This difficulty of seeing oneself through what one sees and vice versa has inspired a few of my essays, but the most original came from the aforementioned The Last Jedi videos series, where I forward an argument diagnosing what I call extra-narrative empathetic displacement. The idea works this way. Say, for example, that you are a man. You identified with a character as a boy. You now watch another film featuring that same character as an adult man, where his human imperfections motivate a conflict with him and the scene's audience surrogate character, a female protagonist. The film adequately conveys both her idealistic view of him and his cynicism towards her, as well as her disappointment. You feel uncomfortable with her. She bothers you. While the male character is the one at fault, you reject this notion and redirect your discomfort with him at her, and in fact it becomes easier to redirect that negativity at the actress portraying her, or the director of the film. Extra-narrative empathetic displacement is a recognition of the fact that, even and especially for some people, a film and director succeeding at teasing out the emotions they want the audience to feel can have unforeseen consequences in the form of the audience's behavior. Something similar can, to use a more concrete example, be seen in the harassment of Ahmed Best, and also in the negativity towards Jar Jar Binks. In a 2017 article for Wired by Brian Rafferty, Best is quoted as saying, "I was believable enough for you to believe that this character existed. George said do a thing, I did a thing, you know what I mean? The fact that you hate Jar Jar, I still did the job." There's a real continuity between the character and the actor in the same way there's a continuity between the director and the film, or the critic and the criticism. For the same reason that in a certain sense it is an artist's job to show the audience something true, I believe the worst critics are liars. They pretend they can tell you or show you something separate from what they see and feel. They pretend to be robots. They believe they can ignore feelings when all they know redounds to how someone made them feel. This is the fundamental contradiction in many value judgments, each of which may omit, but still imply the perspectivity of the speaker. Again, in that same article, Ahmed Best is quoted as saying something quite similar to what George Lucas said. As brunch is winding down, I ask Best, one of the few Star Wars fans to ever find himself tractor-beamed into Lucas's world, what he thinks of the more recent sequels. His verdict? Enjoyable, but risk-free. You're not on the edge of your seat, he says. You're there for the spectacle. You're there for the nostalgia. I'm going to say something controversial. The sequel films were not enough like the Phantom Menace. In fact, the newer characters were not enough like Jar Jar. They had aspects that I find interesting enough, but mostly I like the actors and, as Best says, the spectacle. I love Star Wars, but I have not always accessibly understood it, especially not in its entirety, and I have not always been able to explain myself, especially not completely. I like the difficult parts of love, not just the pure and simple joys, and in the end, if you can only entertain the latter, your happiness will slowly recede into your past, when childhood was made of simple joys, when it should not have been difficult to love, but came more freely. Now you carry more weight with you, and so love is difficult specifically because of what you're bringing to it. Art is like that, you see? This is why, when I think about how the characters of Star Wars are represented, I think of gay representation as an extension of the same thing. The one thing I disagree with Simon Pegg about in his objection to the harassment of Kelly Marie Tran is that it's just a movie and doesn't matter. I know what he means by that, and I appreciate the intent, but I'd like to reframe it. It does matter, and it matters for the same reason we call this study the humanities. There's something human in this that we cannot afford to lose. This all comes back to part of J.J. Abrams' comments that Star Wars is for everyone, and it wouldn't be too much to imagine that the films would reflect our society in some way. 2 days after the debut of The Rise of Skywalker, IGN posted a video with some clips of Oscar Isaac discussing the Storm pilot ship in an interview. Here's what he says in that video.
Yeah, I think that there could have been a very interesting forward-thinking, or even not even forward-thinking, just like current-thinking love story there. You know, it's something that hadn't quite been explored yet, particularly the dynamic between these two men in war who had fallen in love with each other. And I would try to push it a bit in that direction, but the Disney overlords were not ready to do that.
I play you those clips for more evidence of an actor's perspective on the work, but also because if you scroll down that page, you can see how some people responded to this minute and 13-second IGN video. Sorting by best gives us gems like these. WTF, what is wrong with IGN? No, bromances are more organic and real. Romance between two guys isn't what people go to Star Wars for. We've got enough of all that shoved in our face in every form of media, and while it doesn't bother me as I'm supportive, it doesn't mean I want to be force-fed it constantly in everything. Less is more. Oh, STFU, stop trying to shoehorn this crap into every movie. No one cares. Oh, that's right, IGN's office is based out of San Francisco. Gotta push the LGBTQR's LMNO who gives a fuck narrative. Accepting the LGBT community still doesn't change the fact that watching two grown men make out is disgusting. I can't even think about it without being grossed out. And I'll be damned if my 6 and 8-year-olds are going to be exposed to that while watching Star Wars. Stop trying to force crap down people's throats, and just accept that gays are 3% of the population, and seeing two grown men go at it will never be something everyone will be comfortable watching. IGN, what the hell could that have added to this movie, honestly? Placate a certain demographic? Push forward an agenda that's already forced down our throats on a daily basis in many other forms of media? How about we just keep movies like this pure entertainment and keep the politics out of them? Why? No need. So sick of all this PC rubbish. Bring back the 80s. No, I don't want to see two guys making out. For the same reason I don't want to watch my parents making out. If that makes me homophobic, so be it. I accept and respect people's choices when it comes to sexual attraction, but that doesn't mean I must like viewing it. Hopefully you can see the continuity in what we've been discussing and these blatantly homophobic comments. The repeated insinuations of an agenda, the visceral disgust, the labeling of a potential gay romance as political, despite the fact that the straight romances were never judged as such, the appeals to children, the current-day California shtick that is just a reference to coastal liberals and the San Francisco gay community, implicitly also, again, the AIDS crisis, and the sentiment that the relationship is more realistic if it's a friendship instead of a romance, all draw on that same old-school homophobia. The problem here isn't just that there's a few subliterate knuckle-draggers still beating their r/Kotaku in action horse, but rather that this way of thinking, and implicitly this way of approaching the arts, is endemic to our culture at large. Some of the people writing those comments acted like their culture was under siege by a gay battalion, but we just went through the data that shows how little diversity is actually in Hollywood. This is pure delusion, but it comes from a deeper source. Because gay couples are not given the same spectrum of existence as straight couples, they do not exist as equals in the audience's eye, and therefore do not enjoy the same humanization. I don't actually think moralizing about art is very interesting, which is why I try not to do it very often. But in context, this fumble is a double whammy of homophobic disingenuity and utterly lost opportunity. There was little reason that Abrams should have absolutely had to write Oscar Isaac out of so much of The Force Awakens, but there's even less reason why, upon teasing the upcoming films, we needed to be baited with the idea of incoming gay representation for a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment while having foils introduced that appear to assure us that our leads aren't gay. I am trying my best to avoid any level of uncharitability in my critique here. I don't want to make insinuations about Abrams or anyone else who worked on those films, and I don't want to make claims about the films generally beyond what I can show, but it's straight up screwy that this happened. The level of queerphobia at Disney in general, of course, should not go understated in this moment. Somewhat more recently than the last Star Wars film to hit theaters before the COVID-19 pandemic, Disney removed a transgender subplot from the Pixar animated series Win or Lose. I have to admit, this one hit a little too close to home for a few reasons, but having this happen in recent memory reminded me of how little care the corporate scumbags who run these companies have ever given for the artists who make these works or the queer community at large. One of the most obnoxious talking points from recent years, championed by homophobes, has been that gay people should realize these corporations don't actually care. which is some really stupid nonsense, since queer people are talking about that fact constantly and have been for all of living memory, and if you knew anything about us and our history, you'd know that. But the function of queerphobia is heterosexual cisgender power to the exclusion of queer personhood. You don't have to treat us like human beings when you can treat us like ideas that begin to exist when you decide to give us consideration and cease to exist after. Clearly, some very important people at Disney are quite willing to hurt queer people when it's convenient for them, and despite the fact that many of the people with the worst politics imaginable rejoice in this bigotry that has long been and never ceased to be the status quo, we should collect ourselves in the face of this problem. The new boss is the same as the old boss. Disney has not, despite Abrams's desires, moved into the present era. In fact, the present era is, by and large, whatever people with power and privilege say it is, plus whatever we can win for ourselves despite them. Nothing has changed, and that's why it's time for us to stand on business. We could have had something else, and we didn't, and it was all a facade all along. When I hear people talk about the Star Wars we could have had or should have had, I know the truth. The Rise of Skywalker, and maybe the sequels generally, were never for us, not because we didn't support it, not because we didn't love it, not because we weren't always here, or because it wasn't made in part by people who knew us or understood us or thought of us, but because homophobia and transphobia were and continue to be the currency of phony family values. All the posturing about not making things too in your face or wanting something deeper only serves to give the game away. No matter the fact that at times support for gay and trans representation has surged, that support for our movement generally increases as people learn that there are gay and trans people they know and love. People with power still have a normative prescription in their worldview that we are unclean. The issue is not confined to public opinion, but exists as a function of power. I take some small comfort in that. If their propaganda about us was true, then it wouldn't be necessary. If we were so easily erased, then their avoidance of us would not be so thorough and petty. But oppression, as we know, is like the potential energy of social movements. If the chain should snap, if the spark should catch, if the restraints are ever released, then the kinetic force of the freedom of marginalized peoples everywhere becomes a living reality that threatens the privilege of the few with the power of the many. That's the thing about homophobia. You might think that gay or transgender people or any other similar group of people are a small group whose marginalization is therefore either natural or not worth contesting, but the truth is that such groups are the atomistic practice that holds together the larger injustices of society, and if that practice falls apart, then the existence of those larger injustices, exploitations, and abuses is now in question. For now, there are people who delight in their cruelty. They cheer for our repression. It was always their goal or to their profit, and scarcely were they invested in our struggle. We know what real allies look like, and they don't belittle our existence or sacrifice it for convenience. We're floundering now, but we're an idea. We're a group of people as well as a principle, and you can't overcome a principle consequent by affirming its corresponding antecedent. Our day hasn't come yet. What really belongs to us is that fire of love for our community that we keep lit with pride. Still maybe you'll see our rainbow sign. No more crying, this fire is mine.